The anti-woke backlash has continued this week. But this week with a unique twist in that it feels like it has bubbled up some debate within the left. Just today, we have had an interview with Sam Fender, who is a British singer-songwriter, talking about, we are very good at talking about privilege, white, male, or straight privilege. We rarely talk about class, though. And that's a lot of the reason that all the young lads are seduced by demagogues like Andrew Tate. They're being shamed all the time and made to feel like they're a problem. It's this narrative being told to white boys from nowhere towns. People preach to some kid in a pit town in Durham who got fuck all and tell him he's privileged. Then Tate tells him he's worth something. It's seductive. Which, as a sort of white boy from broadly a nowhere town, is an interesting discourse to have floating around. And then, perhaps more notably, Ash Sakar from Novara Media has been doing a media round for her new book, Minority Rule, which I've been very much looking forward to, talking about, well, you can sort of see from the titles of these podcast interviews, this is why the right are winning, how the left is destroying itself, woke is dead, this is the future of politics. And whether from either of these things or just more broadly, there's sort of been a discussion, particularly brewing up on Twitter. I've not been using Twitter much for months and months and months, but on stumbling upon some of these discussions in the more mediated sort of spaces of podcasts, etc., I did find myself drawn back to that kind of collective discussion space of it just for a day or so. And there has been a big conversation over there about whether, quote unquote, wokeness has gone too far. And this has been a conversation which has been brewing for quite some time now. It's kind of been really establishing itself as a common sense within the media. So I really like the work that Novara do. I think it's really difficult to make a media enterprise work. I think to make a left-wing media enterprise work is even more difficult. However, and I've been quite looking forward to Ash's book coming out. From the media round Ash has done, I do get the sense that there is some really interesting stuff in this book, and I'm really looking forward to reading it. However, the media round that she's done has really focused in on a kind of, I'm going to say sort of contrarian left bashing. And I mean, when I say contrarian, I don't I'm not using that as a value judgment. I am saying that there is a kind of, a sort of, I support your aims, but I have this kind of critique sort of vibe. Okay, someone in the chat has said a provocative media round. Maybe that's the better phrase to use. And this media round has broadly channeled this kind of narrative. And I found it really interesting to watch. And so we don't usually on the show do a kind of, we sort of don't really talk about like things people have said in the media. And we certainly don't usually do a kind of throw in shade at people who are broadly coming from the same political background. Partly because that's not my vibe, and partly because as a sort of watcher of stuff and someone that, I don't know, engages with politics in various ways, like, I just don't find that a super interesting thing to do. However, I do think there is an interesting conversation here that that I have some complex feelings about. So when I first saw some of the clips going round from this media round, a bunch of the titles of the videos had sort of something like woke is dead in them. And when I first saw that, my assumption was that was you being used as the sort of just wrapping for the interview, right? That was, that's how you get a few extra views in, and that's sort of part of the headline game, right? However, then I sort of went in and started watching, particularly this clip on Navarra's channel, and actually that sort of language of wokeness still was being used in a way that I find not necessarily massively analytically useful, and set the foundations for some questions that I had about Ash's kind of take, for want of a better word, analysis, which is based on a certain argument that the left, quote unquote, is too annoying, is too fragile. Let's watch the clip.
So what were the gains of woke? And what dates are we looking at here? Like woke, when, not when it starts, but like over what period, and what were the gains?
Well, I think you really have to look at the period in between the shooting of Trayvon Martin by George Zimmerman, which is when the first emergence of BLM happens, and I guess Trump's inauguration. Those are the dates that I'd say you'd have to look at. During that time, other things happen, including the Me Too movement, the famous trans tipping point, which I think, that's not that, oh wow, life's great for trans people. It's actually, trans people have reached a level of heightened visibility, and that people who have made it through universities where, we met at university. That's a time for political exploration and working things out. And that may be some of these, norms around language policing. They go from university into the workplace because that's what those individuals are doing. They're going from the university into the workplace.
And so they're really, one thing at least I will say is that in this instance, Ash kind of gives woke a frame at least, and kind of explains what she means by it. But it's quite surprising as a sort of first step, to see them kind of channeling that language of talking about woke or whatever as though it was a substantive movement. Because wokeness, quote unquote, has always been a right-wing framing of a kind of liberal left politics, and always has been from the very beginning. And in some ways, it has a long history in terms of building off other words which, at certain points in history, have been used as kind of epithets by the political right towards the political left, right? So, in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, then if you thought that ordinary people should be allowed to vote, then you would be called a leveler, right? As a suggesting you had a bit too much in common with not even Oliver Cromwell, but the people that were too radical for him. After the French Revolution at the end of the 18th century, you might have been called a Jacobin, right? Again, even if you were agitating, again, for the fairly simple demand of ordinary people being able to vote for who sits in Parliament and makes laws, you would be a Jacobin. That would be surely really you want to chop everyone's heads off, etc., etc. At some point in the 19th century, everyone to even broadly left-leaning was a communist. And in actual fact, the term communist and communism as a derisive reference to someone to your left predates the Communist Manifesto. If you read the Communist Manifesto, then actually it is written as a response to liberals, conservatives, whatever the equivalent is at that point, the old powers, describing people as communists. And what Marx and Engels and the sort of political parties that they're writing the manifesto for are doing is going, no, we're going to give substance to that, and we're going to take ownership over it, and we're going to write out a program so that when you describe someone as a communist, you call that's communism, actually you can go, well, does it align with our, aims and analysis as laid out? When they write a spectre is haunting Europe, the spectre of communism, they mean a spectre in terms of the fact it doesn't have it doesn't feel like it has a substance in the way that language is used, right? It's a ghost. At some point since the turn of the 21st century, wokeness kind of took on that mantle as the way of describing the politics of some aspect of the left or liberals by the political right. The added benefit of wokeness, or this person is woke or that is woke, is that no one's ever claimed the term, really. And so it becomes really useful to the political right because when you say, back in the day you go, oh, Barack Obama's a communist or whatever, well, people can respond to that and go, well, what aspect of Barack Obama's political program is in any way communistic? Maybe that doesn't bother a lot of people, but it's a minor inconvenience if you're having some sort of political debate, political Barney, right? Whereas wokeness, you never have that problem. And some of what Ash is critiquing here is broadly that. The phrase that she's keen on using is liberal identity politics, which has a bit more of a shape, yet in the way she's using the phrase kind of seems similarly like it can be shaped to be stuff you don't like in a way that I'm not entirely sure is massively useful. But particularly, I think it's worth referring particularly to some of the standout kind of quotes and anecdotes which she's been relating in some of these speeches. So a interview which came out a couple of days ago on the newsagents.
Another example, I know you talk about a particular choice example about Anne Frank, something that was said about Anne Frank, just to try and illustrate. I'm just trying so people aren't lost, illustrate exactly what you mean by the way that people kind of, people who are probably quite well-intentioned in one form or another end up getting slightly lost in this world of kind of identity politics.
I mean, you can really just throw a dart at social media and hit any example, but a few which I cite in the book. One was somebody saying that Anne Frank had white privilege. I mean, if she did, it didn't help her. It didn't
I think
work.
that's fair.
She
had white privilege.
She had white privilege.
Yeah. She had other problems, though.
She had white privilege, other problems. You have examples where someone was talking about the exploitation of DoorDash delivery riders in the United States, and someone was like, but actually, what if you're disabled and then you need them to bring your groceries? And it's like, well, the person complaining about this DoorDash delivery driver wasn't disabled, so where's this come from? But I think that some of the examples which are most laughable, and I think actually get much less attention in our current media environment, is that there is a weaponization of this form of identity politics in the interests of pro-Israeli advocacy. So at the France...
And so Ash goes on to make a sort of much more interesting point, I would say here, about the ways in which Israeli I mean, I'll let her say
Crick
the point.
Institute, some researchers wanted to put on a bake sale to raise money for medical aid for Palestinians. There was then a flurry of complaints to HR saying that it was an allegedly peaceful bake sale and it had made them feel personally threatened and unsafe. If you feel unsafe around a slice of lemon drizzle cake, that's on you.
And so that, I think, is a much more interesting point. Of course, the way in which our kind of media landscape works, and in which our social media landscape works in particular, means that is going to get less coverage. And actually, I found a weird thing that someone said once on Twitter, but I'm going to present it as kind of representative of quote unquote the left. Feels not super useful, and does feel like something you could hear on GB News, which doesn't necessarily mean like which in and of itself wouldn't mean that it's true. I'm not sure picking out a random anecdote feels like a substantive basis for a critique of the left and left strategy. And Ash does kind of skip backwards and forwards between talking about liberals, the left, and people on the left who have adopted liberal identity politics in a way that feels like being able to just jump backwards and forwards. Let's see there was another example in this Politics Joe podcast. Again, Politics Joe, big fan of their work. And you know, I want to say that again, broadly have really enjoyed Ash's work, and continue to enjoy Navarro's stuff. I think this particular thing is a massive misstep. Anyway, here's another anecdote.
So I was like, I either ignore this thing, which seems really important, or I risk pissing off all of my friends by writing about it. So sorry to my friends. And I opened the chapter by talking about an event that I was facilitating in Liverpool. So there's like a couple of hundred people. Everyone wants to discuss what the left has got wrong. Where do we need to go next? And Roger Hallam, who is the co-founder of Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil, who's serving time at the moment, he gets up and he says, well, what's gone wrong is that everyone in this room is a fucking cunt, which I think is the funniest thing anyone could have said.
Yeah.
And I think it's fine if you don't like someone using that language. I think it's fine if you think, ooh, this seems a bit emotionally manipulative. You're trying to shock me into doing what you want. But at the end of the day, it's an old dude who looks like Gandalf swearing. Like it's not a big deal. And then you had all these people who were saying, you've brought violence into the space. I've been harmed. Everyone's been harmed. This is white anger. Like somehow it became a racial thing. And I was like, cunt is not what the C in POC stands for. Like this is not a racialized term at all. And how is it that a room full of adults can be derailed in such a way and can feel comfortable making their distress the object of everyone's attention? And I realized that it's because they've sort of been primed to look for victimhood and look for the ways in which they've been harmed and are actually kind of suspicious of working together.
So again, we kind of get another anecdote, and this is a thing that happened. I was not at this event. I saw some of the fallout from it. I will say that having done a project on JSO, having spent some time with JSO, and I will say this isn't a criticism which was like passed to me from anyone that I was speaking to when we kind of embedded with JSO for a bit. I will say that Roger Hallam is someone who has been kind of shown the side door on most of the organizations he's ever worked with. Like, he has been part of about 4, I want to say, at least, activist organizations. Don't want to, as Ash says, the guy is in prison. He is, his organizations have all done a huge amount of work to rate. Like, I don't want to say he's not necessarily effective. I will say everything I know about him suggests he's not afraid to be provocative. And in fact, the anecdote which is being relayed to there is intentionally provocative. And I do sometimes think, like, well, if you're going to do something intentionally provocative, then maybe don't get surprised when people get provoked. This is just one more of these anecdotes, and then we will stop sort of playing clips, because I think that's enough.
Time something like this has happened. There was an organisers' weekend. I didn't write about this in the book because I wasn't at this organisers' weekend, but a friend was. Where
So just to clarify, this is a friend has told me a thing has happened, which maybe but
we were doing an icebreaker where you had to pretend to be a kitchen utensil, and someone pretended to be a salad spinner, and then some other people said, well, that's white supremacist and classist because who has a salad spinner? And then they were like, well, I came from a working class single parent family and we had a salad spinner. And then the whole thing grinds to a halt because everyone's arguing over who's been the most harmed by salad spinnergate. And it's so... I just don't think Angela Davis did this.
Alex Tab says her point is that she thinks the nature of the complaints about his comment is symptomatic of what has been wrong with some of the left and which has fed the right populist rise, I guess. Yeah, so I will say I can relate to some of these anecdotes, right? I've got a bunch of times where I've been at left-wing political events and there's been someone there who's a little bit odd, who's maybe got a little bit of an odd take, who's maybe a bit antagonistic. I don't think that those anecdotes are necessarily a good basis for dreaming up a critique of sort of quote-unquote the left as a political, social phenomenon. Like, if there was a political party called the Salad Spinners a Racist Party, right? Maybe. If there was a faction within a different political party, Labour enemies of salad spinners or something. Momentum for the abolition of salad spinners. Like, maybe that would be something to base a really strong critique on. The fact that the fact that at no point, at least in what I've seen, the fact that at no point does Ash kind of actually manage to mention a kind of organisation or sort of tendency or a group of people making a sustained attempt to do these particular things, does end up leaving you sort of going, well, it sounds quite profound and clever, and it sounds logical if you've had 2 years of wokeness has gone too far, all the lefts have gone woke, all of this kind of stuff. But it doesn't feel like a substantial basis for a critique of, quote-unquote, the left to go, I saw a tweet once. The other point is that I also am unsure to what extent this stuff is unique to the left either, right? Because the critique here seems to be people on the left are sometimes annoying, okay? Yes, absolutely. People on the left sometimes want to focus on really weird shit instead of instead of something that would be more popular. Absolutely, that happens all the time. People on the left sometimes get caught up in kind of intersectional arguments with one another rather than focusing on like the big enemy of capital, right? Or whatever. Yes, that happens all the time. I'm not convinced that any of that stuff is not only unique to the left, but is unique to politics. I cannot, I will fully say I cannot claim to have done as much sort of organizing, or kind of whatever word we would use to describe it, as Ash has done. Ash has been, a really kind of involved person in the left for, more than a decade. And however, what I have done is done a bunch of stuff in different spaces, right? So whether that's like community stuff or like arts stuff, or or growing up, I grew up in a reasonably small community, and we were quite involved in various kind of clubs and all that kind of like community organizations, all that kind of stuff. And I'm not entirely certain that those kind of behaviors aren't pretty common in any kind of voluntary community organization. I think particularly if you have a space in which people are not being paid to be there, so they're there voluntarily, they are enthusiastic and really care about the thing, and in which sort of anyone can show up, maybe within reason, and maybe not everyone would show up, but sort of anyone, broadly speaking, could. I think you are likely to get those disagreements that, someone who's obsessed with something that seems really irrelevant, someone who just seems to have fallen out with other people, someone who thinks that they're really important and everyone else isn't. Like, I would be very surprised if you didn't have very similar dynamics in every running club, church hall committee, community group, school PTFA in the country. I mean, so Alex Tab saying the standard critique would be that the right don't let these internal divisions hamper their electoral effectiveness as much as the left does, but they do. Like, if you actually take some time to kind of look at what, particularly the far right, but also kind of conservative factions get up to at any point, they're always falling out. They fucking hate each other. However, if you look at the far right, for example, and you look at their political organising, then if you're going to critique them, you're probably going to critique the fact that, like the EDL or whoever are a bunch of racists. You're not going to get on to being like, oh, and they're so disorganised, because it doesn't feel super relevant to the conversation. Whereas one of the things about the left, quote unquote, in like sort of broadest terms of like people who in some way want a more equal society, is that it's really hard to argue that idea in some way isn't a good thing. So you have to find the like, oh, but the road to hell is paved with good intentions. You have to find, oh, it would never work. You have to find, oh, but these people are so disorganized. And so I just don't know whether or not that is as unique as we like to think that it is.